Week 32, Overview. G.H.W. Bush's New World Order. This week we reached the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, who was president for 4 action-packed years from January of 1989 to 1993. President Bush was the last member of the so-called Greatest Generation to become president. Though he grew up wealthy and privileged, like JFK and FDR, Bush hurried to join up after the outbreak of World War II. He became the youngest pilot in the Navy, and he flew over 50 successful missions in the Pacific before being shot down. After the war, he rose in business and then in various government posts, including 8 years as Ronald Reagan's vice president. All this made him remarkably experienced when he succeeded Reagan in January of 1989. Bush would need all that experience and more to deal with a rapidly changing world. The Soviet Union gave up its quest for world domination as the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, adopted policies that led to the total dissolution of the USSR and the Communist bloc. The Cold War was over, but the Middle East got hot. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait threatened America's national security. Bush assembled a multinational coalition to defeat Iraq and liberate Kuwait, but that magnificent military victory in 1990 wasn't enough to convince the American voters to re-elect him when the economy went sour in 1991. Bush lost the election of 1992 to the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. Bush was arguably the most qualified man to ever become president of the United States. His father was a Wall Street banker before he was elected to the U.S. Senate, and the younger Bush was taught that his life's privileges carried with them the responsibility to give back to the country. That's why Bush, at 18, deferred admission to Yale to go fight World War II. Bush became the youngest pilot in the Navy, and he flew 58 combat missions against the Japanese. He was shot down and dramatically rescued, the sole survivor of his crew. During that time of testing, Bush determined that God had saved his life for a reason, and he dedicated himself to serving his country. After the war and his time at Yale, Bush's father urged him to join his Wall Street firm, but young George went to Texas to try the oil business. He did well, becoming a millionaire in his own right. Then, in 1966, he ran for Congress. He won election as a moderate Republican. 4 years later, President Nixon asked him to run for Senate. Bush lost that race, but Nixon appointed him as ambassador to the United Nations. That started his stint in the executive branch. He served as President Ford's official U.S. representative to China, and then as Ford's director of the Central Intelligence Agency for 1 year. Bush was out of office through the Carter years, but in 1980 he threw his hat into the ring for the Republican presidential primary. He ran as a moderate against the much more conservative Ronald Reagan. Reagan won, but picked Bush for his vice president. In 1988, after 8 years in Reagan's shadow, Bush ran once again for the highest office in the land. Conservative voters were skeptical. They remembered what Bush had called Reagan's plan for cutting taxes back in the 1980 primary, voodoo economics. They wanted assurances that Bush wouldn't revert to his old ways if they elected him, so Bush gave them an emphatic promise that he had learned his lesson. "Read my lips," he said. "No new taxes." That was enough to satisfy a majority, and Bush moved into the White House. As president, he called for a kinder, gentler nation and signed expensive legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act and amendments to the Clear Air Act of 1970. His social and environmental focus wasn't all through government programs, however. He emphasized volunteerism and called upon 1,000 points of light of private activities to help the poor. The defining event of Bush's one term was the first Persian Gulf War. It started when Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded the little neighboring state of Kuwait. Students met Saddam last week in the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. Hussein had borrowed billions from the oil-rich Arab states around the Persian Gulf during that long, slow war, and he tried to get them to cancel Iraq's debts on the grounds that he had helped protect them all. Hussein also wanted his neighbors to limit their oil production. Too much oil was driving down prices. Then, to make matters worse, Kuwait refused Iraq's request to lease 2 strategically placed islands. Eventually, Hussein had had enough. On August 2, 1989, 100,000 Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher denounced the invasion. President Bush called an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, which condemned the action and then demanded that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait immediately and unconditionally. Kuwait's neighbors were nervous. If Hussein would attack one oil-rich nation so brazenly, who else was safe? If Iraq gained control of Saudi Arabia, Hussein would control half the world's oil. That could be disastrous for America and the rest of the industrialized world. Bush sent troops to Saudi Arabia to prevent a possible invasion by Iraq, called Operation Desert Shield. Hussein responded by declaring jihad, holy war, on the United States. He expected the rest of the Arab world to join him, but Bush's diplomatic moves left them divided. The 21-member League of Arab States voted days after Hussein's invasion of Kuwait to help protect Saudi Arabia, and several of them joined the multinational coalition. Saddam Hussein was alone. At this point, Hussein could have negotiated for peace, but he didn't. Bush ratcheted up the pressure, sending more American troops to the Gulf. On January 12, 1990, the U.S. Congress authorized the use of force in the Gulf, and American warplanes went on the attack. Hussein went on the radio to rally his people. "The great duel, the mother of all battles, has begun. The dawn of victory nears as this great showdown begins." He began to launch missiles at Israel, hoping to draw them into the war and bring more Arab nations to his side. It didn't work. Israel held its fire, but the U.S. did not. Operation Desert Storm swung into gear, rolling over the Iraqi army within days. Bush had the opportunity to pursue the fleeing troops back into Iraq, but he held back. The mission was to free Kuwait, not conquer Baghdad. Bush's approval ratings skyrocketed for a number of months after this brief and dazzling operation in early 1990. But by the time he ran for re-election in 1992, things had changed. Diplomatic and military victories overseas didn't pay the bills back home. In July 1990, the U.S. economy entered a recession. A few months later, Bush signed legislation raising federal taxes, a move that seemed necessary in light of the ever-expanding federal budget deficit. When Bush broke his read-my-lips promise, many conservatives abandoned him. With a strong third-party challenge from businessman Ross Perot, Bush lost his bid for re-election in 1992. Bush lost the White House, but Mikhail Gorbachev, his counterpart in the Kremlin, lost his country. Gorbachev was the youngest party head to ever lead the USSR. Unlike his older colleagues, Gorbachev was willing to face the truth that the Soviet economy was teetering on the brink of implosion. He tried to save it through rapid technological reform and increased productivity, dismantling the inefficient Soviet bureaucracy and expanding civil freedoms. Gorbachev instituted a new policy called glasnost, openness. For the first time in the history of the Soviet Union, elections were open to candidates who weren't handpicked by the Communist Party. He also opened the door to private enterprise and free market activities. People in other countries behind the Iron Curtain saw what Gorbachev was doing in the USSR, and they wanted the same. There were waves of popular demonstrations for civil freedoms. In the old days, the Soviet army would have crushed such uprisings, but for the first time since World War II, Gorbachev reduced the number of troops in Eastern Europe, and then removed them altogether. The satellite countries of Eastern Europe could at last run their own governments their own way. In 1988, Gorbachev renounced the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had declared the USSR's right to intervene militarily within the Warsaw Pact nations whenever it deemed necessary. A consequence of this was that many of the republics within the USSR declared themselves independent or sovereign. Lithuania, conquered by Stalin in World War II and forced to be a member of the USSR, was the first republic of the United Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to declare independence in 1990. From this point on, Russia and most of the other republics that made up the USSR voted to dissolve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and replace it with a Commonwealth of Independent States. By the end of 1991, all of the Soviet republics had declared their freedom. The hardcore communists thought Gorbachev was a traitor. In August of 1991, the KGB, the Soviet National Security Agency, and old guard Soviets in the army moved against Gorbachev and placed him under house arrest. The leaders of the coup then laid siege to the Parliament building of the Russian Republic, where Russian President Boris Yeltsin and his followers barricaded themselves inside. Thousands of Russian citizens, some armed and some not, stood up to the attackers. They formed a human chain around the Parliament, refusing to allow the attackers through. Within days, the coup collapsed. The world watched on television as Gorbachev emerged and Yeltsin came out of the besieged building. Gorbachev was obviously shaken, and Yeltsin boldly took center stage. The sun had set on Gorbachev's Soviet Union, and Yeltsin's Russia was on the rise. The end of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War once and for all, but history never stands still. As Americans celebrated the end of Russia's evil empire, radical Muslims raged against the defiling presence of American troops on sacred Saudi Arabian soil. The global clash between communism and capitalism ended without a thermonuclear showdown, but the seeds of the next conflict had already taken root.